for joining us. And now at this time, I would like to welcome and introduce Her Excellency Ambassador Arikana Chihombori-Quao to share with us her vision for the 8th PAC. Thank you, Ambassador. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Brother Siphiwe. And thank you, Brother Damien. And of course, thank you to all the Pan-Africanists who are on the call today. I appreciate all the work that you all have been doing over the years. And while the mission is not yet accomplished, we are coming together today to see how we can continue the movement and hopefully put us on a better path where the mission can be accomplished. Maybe not during our time, but at least pave a clear path that we can leave behind for our children to continue the struggle. Now, most of you probably know me. My name is Arikana Chihombori, a medical doctor really and a scientist for most of my life, but somehow ended up being called to go to Washington and become the AU ambassador to the United States, which I thought was a fluke. And I really did believe they really wanted me to do so initially, because I didn't think a medical doctor could become a diplomat overnight. However, what I later found out, after being in Washington, I didn't realize how being a medical doctor had more than adequately prepared me to be a diplomat. I didn't realize that on a daily basis, I was being diplomatic with my patients. And you may not realize that sometimes patients come to see us and they don't tell us the truth. And yet they still need help from you. So the onus is on a doctor to figure out a way of being in a patient's home without being physically there. The onus is on the doctor to figure out what else could be going on at work, at the patient's work without being there. What could be happening with the children? I did not realize that those abilities would then come in handy in my work as a diplomat in Washington. And I was a little bit slow because when I look back, some of you may not be aware that the chairman of the African Union who appointed me was Madam Zuma, who herself was a pediatrician, another diaspora, trained in the United Kingdom. So somehow I didn't put 2 and 2 together until I was now in the market. And then I realized her wisdom, because I had denied to take the position for almost 6 months and she insisted she needed somebody like me. Be it as it may, I spent my time in Washington. I was appalled at what I saw, from the abuse of the Africans, and I'm talking African dignitaries coming to the United States, African dignitaries within the continent. The abuse was blatant, and they never expected any pushback. So when I started pushing back, because I couldn't really leave a room after we've all been abused and let them think we took it, we accepted it, and we are running away with our tails between our legs. I decided, initially I'd meant to stay only for 6 months. I did not mean to stay long. I was going to Washington out of respect for those who were asking me to do so. But I also knew I would have sufficient evidence after 6 months to show them that, look, I tried and I couldn't do it. But something happened around the 5th month of my stay in Washington, staying in a hotel, because I didn't want to waste my time getting into a contract with an apartment or a home. But the abuse was so blatant, and so I decided I was going to hang around a little bit longer. I also realized that a lot of the ambassadors in Washington, they really are between a rock and a hard place. They can't always speak out like they want to. Because I found out that a simple phone call from the State Department to their foreign minister or to their president, and all they have to say is your ambassador is being uncooperative. They don't need to explain anymore. And before you know it, the ambassador is called back. So there was that element of fear to speak out and speak the truth. But I felt that I did not have anything to lose. I really didn't want to be there. I'd given myself 6 months, and now I'm going to stay as long as they can put up with my fighting. And I was ready to leave whenever they're tired of my fighting. I won't share the choice words I used when I made that decision to my colleagues. Be it as it may, I stayed what I thought would be yet another short stint, no more than a year. And I continued to be exposed to the workings of the relationships, bilateral relationships between Africa and the Americas, bilateral relationships between Africa and Europe, bilateral relationships within African countries, and of course, the core operations of the African Union. One of my mandates included, in addition to, of course, engaging the US government, it included mobilization of the African diaspora. I sat and listened to deliberations from time to time, not often, when they would be talking about African diaspora. It became very clear to me that every time African diaspora are discussed, then I realized they weren't really talking about the historic diaspora. It was always, each president is talking about the diaspora, those born in his country who are now living outside Africa. When I began to look at some of their diaspora policies, 100%, they were only talking about how to repatriate those citizens from their country who are now living outside Africa. So I decided I needed to begin a program of unifying us as African diaspora outside Africa, because within the continent, we are being divided. I began to address African diaspora in the United States as one group, not as Ghanaians, not as Ethiopians, not as Zimbabweans, not as African Americans, but as all people of African descent. I made that my mission, because even at the State Department, they would always say, oh, we are going to Minneapolis, we're going to Minnesota, we're going to be addressing the Ethiopians, we're going to be addressing the Somalis. And my response was always to them, no, you should go to Minneapolis to address all the African diaspora, and that includes the African Americans. I know I would say it repeatedly, would isolate us. I even had a conversation where I was told, oh, Africans, continental Africans are smarter than African Americans. This was someone from the State Department. I was walking out. As you go to the State Department, you are assigned officers who meet you outside and they carry you in and bring you back. So one of them, we were walking out. He said, but Ambassador, how come you respect diaspora so much? Nobody seems to respect African diaspora. I said, well, I don't know, my dear, who you're speaking on behalf of, but I have a lot of respect for the African diaspora. And a lot of people I know, they have a lot of respect for the African diaspora. And the diaspora that I know, they have a lot of respect for themselves. I'm saying this to say, I want you all to understand the environment that we're fighting this struggle. Even on the continent, I shared some intimate conversations I've had with some people pertaining to the perception of African diaspora. I will not share that with you, but I did share some of it with Brother Baleka. We are fighting an uphill battle that is based on ignorance and misinformation. But be it as it may, I set all out to begin to unite the African diaspora as one and refuse the divisions that have been entrenched among us. A lot of them subliminally, a lot of them based out of ignorance. And so it is. I was on a mission to educate the diaspora. And as I traveled around the United States and the Americas, I was appalled and the extent to which the African diaspora, and by that I mean all people of African descent, did not understand the core issues as to what was really going on. What was even more appalling is the realization that as bad as the situations are, and I decided to pick one issue, which was the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization, because it was, for me, one of the biggest abuses of human rights, the biggest exploitation, blatant exploitation of the continent. To my surprise, even a lot of the members of Congress were not aware of it. I even had an address at the African Union, and that at that time, the commander of AFRICOM was not aware of it. And after I presented to him the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization, I looked at him, I said, you see, Commander, as you're fighting on the continent alongside the French, you're sleeping with the enemy. Now here's someone who's fighting alongside the French and was not aware of the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. The current mayor of Los Angeles, after I started being vocal with my first video on the French and what they were doing, she asked me to come and present to her and some members of Congress. And after I finished my presentation, and I'm seeing some of the members looking quite baffled, some thinking, oh, is this woman really know, does she know what she's talking about? I challenged the staffers to go, and I saw the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. And slowly I could see their faces change as they were handed the form. They too, including my sister Karen Bass, had not heard about the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. That is the depth of the ignorance that is going on. So on that note, I decided I was going to go full force to educate, to inform, and to redirect where our emphasis, where our energies should be. So it is, my video started. I continued to mobilize, I continued to travel around the country. I even went to South America, I went to the Caribbean, trying to re-inform the African diaspora that the issues we are wasting time on are issues that do not move the needle at the end of the day. That the issues we needed to focus on are here. That we need to understand the enemy and strategize as to how to deal with the enemy, rather than just jumping in and throwing arrows, bows and arrows in every direction. And at the end of the day, accomplish nothing. So that was my journey of redirecting and informing the diaspora as to what was really going on and what was causing this African tree of life to be ailing, and that we needed to understand the root causes. Because all along, we are being meant to focus on the leaves, the flowers, the branches that come and go one season after the other, and completely thrown a shiny object so we could stay away from the root causes as to why this African tree is ailing. And those root causes are understanding that after the Second World War, as the Western world had destroyed themselves, they needed to rebuild. And where are their natural resources coming? They're coming from the developing countries. The majority of them, of course, are in Africa. So they set up the Bretton Woods institutions specifically to make sure that the rebuilding of their nations is going to be sponsored by the developing nations with all the natural resources. The Bretton Woods institutions were set specifically for the purposes of making sure that their success is based on the failure of developing nations, majority, of course, being in Africa. It's important that you also understand how the World Trade Organization was set up. Again, it was set up to siphon natural resources out of Africa and other developing nations. Therefore, it should not surprise you that Switzerland has for decades been labeled as Swiss coffee, major producer of Swiss coffee, Swiss chocolate. Everywhere you go around the world, there's not a single cocoa plantation in Switzerland. Why is the World Trade Organization giving it a blind eye? East Africa has some of the best teas. Our farmers are being given pennies to the dollar. And their teas suddenly are relabeled. The World Trade Organization is fully aware of that. When West Africa decided to start add value to their cocoa beans, the tariffs that were slapped on the value-added goods were so high that it wasn't even worth adding value to the cocoa beans. It's only the last few years that Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana have started adding value to their cocoa beans. It was all by design. And so until we understand the root causes of why Africa's tree of life is ailing, until we begin to understand the presence, ever-presence of the invisible hand, that when the invisible hand decides to shake the tree, all the issues that we thought mattered, which are the leaves and the flowers, they fall off. And they just wait until they regrow the next season. They might let you get away with it for 2 years, 3 years before they shake the tree again. The question then becomes, what are we going to do about it as a people? The reality is, as African countries and Caribbean countries were getting their independence, quote unquote, independence from the occupiers back in the 1950s into the 60s. And of course, there were a few unfortunate ones who had to fight for their liberation. My brothers and sisters, we only received political independence, which is limited as well, because the invisible hand controls who gets to be in power and for how long. We were denied across the board economic liberation. Even here in the United States, you're looking at those 40 acres and a mule. If Black people had been awarded that 40 acres and a mule, the Blacks would be in a much better position. As we speak today, 0.1% of the US wealth is in the hands of Black people, 0.1%. Inheritors of one of the richest continents on earth. Your birthright is being siphoned every day by the Chinese, by the Europeans, by the Middle Easterners, the Indians. And you're busy being told, don't go to Africa, it's a diseased and dying continent. Of course, those on this platform, you are awoken and you get it. But the reality is majority of the people of African descent, they don't get it, they don't understand it, and they must be told road to power. So it is on that note that I've been on my own journey as well, just dealing with issues of Pan-Africanism. In January this year, I created, of course, ADDI soon after leaving the AU, because I felt that the work I started was going to fall apart if I did not continue. So African Diaspora Development Institute was created to continue the education and the mobilization and the awakening of our people by simply telling them our truths and our facts, and hoping through knowledge and understanding of what is really going on, it'll be easier to wake up. For let's make no mistake about it. Too many of us are still fast asleep. Too many of us are busy thinking they have arrived, but they forget that they still have children. They have grandchildren. There are other generations to come. The question is, what kind of a world do you want to live for them? Are you comfortable with the world the way it is today? And are you willing to leave it behind for your children and generations to come? I would hope the answer is no. So January this last year, after spending 2 years of speaking the gospel of truth through various webinars and meetings that I could attend, and of course, COVID got in the way, I felt it was time for us to be boots on the ground and not continue to just talk, but we needed action. Because at the end of the day, no money, no voice. So we could talk all we want, we can strategize all we want, but if at the end of the day, we are still going to the same people who put us in the positions that we are in systematically and intentionally, we're still enslaved. The realization that as long as we are going to have this fake political independence, without the economic liberation, we are still enslaved. Of course, I understood Africa, but I also know that it's one thing to understand Africa continentally, but it's also a different thing to be right on the ground and really meet with people and really understand what's going on and create the necessary relationships to see certain conversations through to the end. So what started out as a 2-month trip into Africa, visiting various countries, it ended up being almost a year. I started with Tanzania. I was supposed to be there for a week. I ended up being there 3 weeks. Then I went to Uganda, then I went to Zambia, then I went to Malawi. Of course, I had been to Nigeria and Ghana previously. I've since been to Namibia, of course, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, actually, I thought Zimbabwe, I was also looking for headquarters for ADDI. I didn't think I would end up in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, I only went because it's home. But to my surprise, the reception was amazing. And then as I began to also understand the opportunities, they are so low hanging, I didn't have a choice but to say, you know what, this is where we probably need to start. So it is we have a headquarters in Harare, where we're beginning the work of looking into investing in mining and in agriculture. Why those two areas is because of what I've seen. Chinese, some of you may not know, are sending prisoners right from prison. Give them a little money and send them to Africa. In a matter of few months, they are multimillionaires, and I've seen it with my own eyes. So after really seeing all this and saying to myself, we don't need any help from anybody. We can raise the money, one, from ourselves, and secondly, by simply reclaiming our birthright. Africa's wealth belongs to the children of Africa, at home and abroad. That's just a fact. The children of Africa, we don't have a choice but to come together, unite for the purposes of playing at the same level as the Chinese. That is the only place they are beating us. They're coming in with $300,000. They're coming with $500,000. They're coming in with $1 million. All they have to do is acquire one single lithium mine. I've seen Chinese abandon brand new equipment, mining equipment that they brought. Why did they abandon it? They abandoned it because after 6 months, the amount of money they made in 6 months is so huge that the cost of the equipment is so insignificant. They take and they run. My brothers and sisters, during my travels, there were 2 heads of states I met with. The first one, I was on my attack mode. And I was simply asking the president, I said, Your Excellencies, when you created and approved the 6th region with a definition that says all people of African descent living outside Africa, I said, what were you thinking of? That is not an equal statement. You are making an assumption that the continentally born Africans are equal to the descendants of the formerly enslaved. I said, Mr. President, let me create a scenario for you. If you were to stand at the edge of the Americas, East Coast, and you yell and say, all people of African descent as defined by the African Union, please, come on, let's walk across the Atlantic, assuming we can. Let's go home to Africa. And I said, Mr. President, we'll come out in droves. And we will walk across the Atlantic. I said, but Mr. President, see what's going to happen when we get to the west coast of Africa. You're going to start asking us, oh, where were you born? This one says I was born in Nigeria. Oh, come on in, my brother. This one says, oh, I was born in Sierra Leone. Sure, my sister, come on in. And then we come to a brother who was born in Los Angeles, California. You're going to ask them, where's your visa? I said, Mr. President, your definition is incomplete. There is an equalization process that must take place. Descendants of the formerly enslaved, they too need a passport. They too need a citizenship in Africa. When that is done, then your definition is meaningful. So my question to the president was, what were you all thinking when you incorporated the 6th region into the Union Constitution? And you did not take the step further to justify what it's going to take to make sure that those children of Africa in the diaspora that you're talking about are indeed equal. And that's when this president sat back. He said, my sister, we have done our part. We have incorporated the 6th region into the Constitution of the African Union. And he went on to say, what is needed and has not yet happened, and I'm simply quoting him, what is needed and has not yet happened is a gathering of true representation of Africans in the diaspora from every corner of the world. He said that meeting hasn't happened yet, as far as we know, as head of states. He said it cannot be a group of people from South America. It cannot be a group of people from the United States. It cannot be a group of people from the Caribbean. It has to be a group of people from everywhere where Black people are. True representation of the African diaspora. He said, if such a gathering could take place, I can tell you, my sister, we will approve. If your demands are reasonable, we will approve them. Now, if you think you can put such a gathering together and you can find a host country, that's why you begin the process. So it is what started out as a 1-hour meeting. It ended up as a 4-hour meeting. When it started out as an attack mode on my end, I was taken to school. The president put me through what needed to be done. Very simply, in a very practical way. Took me back to the first Pan African Congress that took place on the African soil. Spoke about Julius Nyerere, President Julius Nyerere, what he had in mind. I was educated. And then I was, of course, determined. I must also meet the 7th or 2nd Pan African Congress held on the African soil. Again, I was taken to school. I was told about what needed to happen. So on that note, I honestly thought this was going to happen in Uganda or Tanzania. But as I traveled around and I began to understand what was happening in Zimbabwe with the sanctions and all, I thought, well, let me talk to the president of Zimbabwe and share with him the meetings that I've had with his colleagues. And of course, he was very happy to host the Pan African Congress. So initially, I was also thinking it would be the 9th Pan African Congress. But as I began to read some more, and I needed to go back for a second meeting, and this time with President Museveni in his capacity as the global patron for Pan-African affairs, and specifically to ask him for how to proceed, and that I'd found a host country that was willing to sponsor and host what I was calling the 9th Pan-African Congress. He then corrected me and he said, my sister, you should call it Pan-African Congress Part 1. I'd sent him all the information. I talked about the areas that I felt needed to be addressed if we're going to truly take our position and participate in the building of the Africa we want. I had reviewed the outcomes of the first two, 74 and 94. And of course, when those two were held, we did not have the 6th region. But be it as it may, the issues that I felt were the beef of the matter, the issues that I felt would address the issue at hand, which is economic liberation, were not very strongly represented in the last two, 74 and 94. In a very practical way, no money, no voice. We need true representation at the African Union. When you look at ECOSOC is a joke. ECOSOC diaspora were thrown a bone so we can run off and start fighting each other and talk about nothing. We're diaspora. First of all, we don't even understand the African Union. Africans themselves don't understand the African Union. So then how are we supposed to come together and then advise the African Union? when we don't even understand how the African Union works. It's a joke, my brothers and sisters. Where we need to be, where the decisions are being made, is the Permanent Representative Council. Every country in Africa sends an ambassador to the Permanent Representative Council. As an ambassador, if I wanted to buy a chair, I would submit my request with justification to the Permanent Representative Council. From the smallest issues to the biggest issues, everything enters the AU governance through the Permanent Representative Council. These 55 ambassadors reside in Addis. They are the engine, the brain of the African Union. That which they can clear, approve, that is within their pay grade, they approve. What they cannot, they pass it on to the Executive Council, which is made up of the foreign ministers. They meet twice a year, 4 days before the African Heads of State Summit. They will also deliberate. What they can approve, they approve. What they cannot, they pass it on to the Assembly, to the heads of states. So let's understand that system, that governance process. If we are missing in this conversation, then where are we? Who are we? What are we doing? Because we're not on the inside to understand these issues, the dynamics of how things work. If we're not in the Permanent Representative Council, we're nowhere. We're a joke. And I can tell you, I've heard in many circumstances, people laugh at the conversations coming out of ECOSOC, coming out of the diaspora. I'll be very honest with you, we're actually not respected. It's a very sad reality, but I'm just telling you like it is. We have got to redefine ourselves. We have got to make sure we find a process that we find ourselves on the table, not in the periphery. ECOSOC is not going to do it. So when we now take the process and say to you, African heads of states, like they clearly told me, we have allowed you to come in by adding you to the Constitution. Now the work is yours. It's up to you, diaspora, to tell us what you want. And that's why we're here today. We use the systems and the processes that they have put in place. So if you said we are the sixth region, we therefore need to have our own headquarters set up much like the other 5 regions. The other 5 regions, they each send a group of ambassadors to the African Union headquarters to be part of the Permanent Representative Council, to be part of the decisions and deliberations to do with our beloved continent. So we too, according to your approval, your own constitution, we must have representation from the diaspora. And I used an example of our size, population-wise, is similar to ECOWAS. ECOWAS sends 15 ambassadors to the African Union, Permanent Representative Council, PRC. So we also must ask for representation of at least 10 to 15 ambassadors from the diaspora, from the Americas, from the Caribbean, from South America, from Europe, from Asia. Wherever Black people are, we must have representation. We must have an ambassador who's also going to advocate for diaspora issues. The ambassadors in the Permanent Representative Council, they're advocating for their countries first, then they're advocating for their region secondarily, they're advocating for the continent thirdly. And nowhere are we being represented. And they gave us the joke, ECOSOC. My brothers and sisters, it's important that we understand process. The issue of equalizing the definition of the African diaspora is a pivotal one. Until descendants of the formerly enslaved have a clean, clear pathway to citizenship, whether they want to exercise it or not, but it should be there. Then, and only then, will this definition be meaningful. Until there's proper representation of the African diaspora at the Permanent Representative Council, as well as the Executive Council, we're not equal. So let's check what they have approved as the sixth region. Let's check what's in their constitution and work through the system. We understand that the issue of citizenship is a sovereign one. African Union cannot approve it. However, we meet, we come up with a document, we find a head of state to deliver it to his brothers and sisters. We get a decision on citizenship. Each and every head of state still has to go back to his parliament and put through this decision for ratification. So therefore, we must come up with a document that talks about dual citizenship, that is practical, that gives options that are practical. So for us to think we can just walk into Africa and say we are descendants of formerly enslaved and we were forcibly taken out of Africa, therefore give us land, give us mineral rights, it's not going to work because locals don't have it. Locals don't have mineral rights. Locals don't have lands. Diaspora who live outside Africa, they don't have land when they go back home. They have to figure out how to get land. And so we need to come up with practical situations, scenarios that we know when they are tabled to the 55 different parliaments around the continent, that those parliamentarians, who, by the way, they don't understand a whole lot of what we're talking about. In fact, to show you the level of the ignorance sometimes, I was talking to one MP who looked at me very sincerely and said, Ambassador, don't you think Americans will feel insulted that we want them to come to Africa and become Africans? I said, Honorable Minister, MP, what are you talking about? He said, well, we all want to be Americans, so why would they want, we feel like we'll be insulting them by asking them to become Africans. Then I had to take him to school as well. I said, no, Honorable Minister, the children want to come home. Then I had to give him the history again. And those are the people who are going to be making decisions. They only look at all of us as people who will need to come to Africa and bring money. You bring money to Africa. That's all they see. And I had to convince them that no. When we talk about African diaspora, we're not talking about Zimbabweans who are now living outside Africa, Nigerians, Ghanaians, Ethiopians. I am constantly having to revisit this story, re-educating. I just have to keep talking. Those are the people who are going to be making decisions on whether or not you become a citizen of any African country. So let's be very clear about that. So as we go through the deliberations, the first item that we discussed weekend before last is the pathway to citizenship. Brother Baleka will be happy to share with you the different options that came up. People really came up. There was one that I had not even thought about for the retirement for the elderly. But it was a very healthy discussion about the different ways that we can look at having a pathway to citizenship, different options. Last weekend, we talked about the sixth region. They made it very clear. The headquarters for ECOWAS is in West Africa, for SADC, in Botswana, for East Africa, Central North Africa. Of course, they're doubling up their headquarters between the regions as well as the RECs. But be it as it may, we also had a healthy discussion about the sixth region. Where should it be? We need our headquarters. Once we have our headquarters, we then demand to say, just like the other 5 regions on the continent, we must also have representation. So we have to ask the heads of states, make our case that you got to open 10 to 15 slots at the PRC level. So we too can advocate for the diaspora, because currently we have no voice. No one is advocating for diaspora issues, and we no longer continue to be seen as nothing but people who bring money to the continent and getting nothing back. What is in Africa is our birthright. And we're organizing for the purposes of saying, no more shall you give contracts to the Chinese, no more shall you give contracts to the Europeans, because you don't know where to find the African diaspora, because we will have our sixth region. We're also going to say, we know China doesn't look outside China for development. Europe doesn't look outside Europe for development. Africa, therefore, must not look outside Africa for development, because the children of Africa are ready, willing, and able. Statement. That message must be made very clear to the African heads of state, but we also must act accordingly. We must unite. So through the 6th region, which is well organized, with the headquarters just like the others, they will have one phone call to send those contracts. So we can truly have the first right of refusal of all contracts deemed international by the African heads of states, by the countries, as is their reasoning, and understandably so, they don't know how to get in touch with us. I was talking, just keeping things simple here. I was talking to one head of state. There was $3 billion that was getting ready to come into that country for a particular investment from one of the Western countries. But that document also stipulated that 60% of those funds must go to contracts from Western nations. So this president said to me, Ambassador, we have a way of leveraging as we are negotiating these contracts. If we knew that there was a way where we can get Black people to also tap into this money, we know very well that 60% is not going to go to Black companies. But we cannot make a case of saying we also demand that 30%, 40% of that 60% must also be contracts that go to Black people. He said, Ambassador, if we knew they were there, we would insist on it. So that way, we also take care of you all from the African side. But because we don't know whether you guys are organized, whether the companies are there, we just sign the documents like that. But we wish if you all were organized, that we have a way of reaching out to you. We have a way of knowing what you're doing, who you are. So we can at least make those recommendations. I'm saying this to say, while the heads of states understand the importance of the diaspora, they're also at a quandary as to how to approach and reach out to the diaspora. We're not organized for the purposes of economic development. So the 6th region is going to serve this role. A well-established headquarters of the 6th region, a well-orchestrated registry of companies with their profiles and what they're capable of doing. We can then make a decision and address another issue that is an agenda item on what we hope to do in Harare, which is first right of refusal for all contracts deemed international by all African countries. Yesterday, we deliberated on the establishment of Pan Afrikan Fund. And again, I'm going to keep sounding like a broken record. No money, no voice. I do know that if we truly come together and be of the right spirit, be of the same accord, much like the guerrilla fighters who walked out of their homes, who walked out of their high schools, right into the bush with the only understanding that what was happening in Zimbabwe, what was happening in Namibia, was what was happening in Angola, Mozambique, Algeria, Mauritius, Kenya, you name it, was unacceptable. And that I am going to go north. I shall come to a country that is sympathetic to my cause. And I shall train, I shall come back with a gun, and I'll fight to defend what belongs to me. It's only a handful of people who made that total commitment because they were sick and tired of being sick and tired. They did their part. Many did not make it back. Zimbabwe is where it is today because of the few men and women who stood up. Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, many other countries, South Africa. A few stood up. They were sick and tired of being sick and tired. We're being called upon at this moment because while we have fought the war of resistance, that's our ancestors, the Jamaican Maroons, the Mbianeanders of Zimbabwe. All those resistance wars, they lost because they fought with bows and arrows. The Maroons did win. They were the first ones to defeat the British. And then we fought the second wars of liberation in Zimbabwe and many others. We went into guerrilla warfare. This time we had guns. So we won. One country after the other, with South Africa being the last one to get its independence. Zimbabwe has yet another war, which was the war of the liberation of the land. That too has been won. So it's one of the few that have succeeded at taking back its land. But what is still missing, my brothers and sisters, is the true economic liberation. The systems that have been put in place to see to it that no matter where you see us as Black people, we are forever defeated and dominated. May I repeat that? The systems that have been put in place globally are such that no matter where you find us as people of color, as people of African descent, we are forever defeated and dominated. No matter how hard we work, no matter how much we try, we will never get a leg up. It is all by design. So naturally, you can't expect the same systems that are put in place to oppress you for us to then go to them and say, please help us. Please fund us. It's a joke. It won't work. You know, Martin Luther once said, you can't expect people without boots to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Well, guess what? This time we have the boots. We just need to pull ourselves up. 1 million people, 1 million diaspora with $100 a month for a year, you figure it out. Now make it 2 million people for 2 years. Now make it 3 million people for 5 years. Now make it 5 million people for 5 years. You see the kind of monies we're talking about? This is money that you guys are spending to go to McDonald's. Monies you're spending doing stupid things. Monies you'll never miss. All it takes are people with the right mindset. People with the same mindset, just like the guerrilla fighters who left everything, risked their lives because they believed in something better. They believed in that I can do something. I do not care what somebody else is doing. I know that I got to play my part. That we're building this beautiful house on the hill and I'm holding a brick that is needed to build that house. So I will do my part. I am not going to worry about what somebody else has done. But let's not lose focus on the ball. The ball for them was the liberation of their countries. But the ball for us is economic liberation of our people. We have the boots, we have the straps. All we gotta do now is pull ourselves by those bootstraps. We're talking monies that can never break any of you. What's needed is unity of purpose. So yes, the conversations yesterday about how do we start a Pan African Diaspora Fund, a fund that's going to concentrate on playing as equal partners on the development of projects in Africa. The contracts that are going to the Chinese, the reason we're not participating as high flyers because we don't have the money. But if the funding is there, and diaspora, a woman from Louisiana, a woman from Jamaica, a woman from Brazil can become a shareholder of this massive fund. And this fund, the sole purpose is to focus on also capitalizing on those contracts with huge returns. There will be thousands of airports built in Africa in the next 10 years. Those contracts must all come to us. Railway lines, roads, manufacturing, mining, agriculture, returns you can't even imagine. And when those returns come, that woman in Louisiana who is a shareholder, that's how she benefits from her birthright. That woman in Colombia who is a shareholder of this mega fund, that's how she benefits from her birthright in Africa. And I'm talking for those who are not able to go to Africa, but we are creating a mechanism for them to benefit from their birthright. The Pan African Fund is a must, and we have everything we need to make it a success. So we will be asking the government of Zimbabwe, or it might end up being in any other government, to back us as we establish this fund. It's going to be a global fund run by those gurus in fund management. diaspora, some on the continent, but it's going to be a global fund whose sole purpose is to repatriate, to benefit from what is currently being siphoned out of Africa by those who do not mean well for the continent. The same fund is also going to be used to make sure that those who want to develop their own Black communities, those who want to change the paradigm of saying no more shall we have our communities loaded with Chinese owning the grocery store, with Middle Easterners owning the mechanic shop, with Laotians owning the nail parlor, many other businesses. We want to change that. So now Black people can apply to change as long as you are applying to be a business owner in your Black community and you are changing the narrative. You're making sure that the Black dollar at least stays a week within our community. That we must do. Currently, the Black dollar is lucky to last 6 hours in the community. As soon as our people are paid, we're running to Walmart, we're going to McDonald's, we are going to the hairdresser, we're going to buy Brazilian hair from Laotian place. Our money is out of our community in a flash. That fund is now going to make it possible for our own people, no matter where we reside as people of color, we can access those funds. And of course, the fund comes along with the Diaspora Bank. These are practical things we can do if we can get just a small critical mass of people who get it. Yes, I commit to my $100. I'm going to buy my shares. It's not a donation. These are shares that you own. So yes, we want to talk about that. We want your input. Brother Baleka collected some good information that he's going to compile, and we're going to come up with a short list of things that people, the input from people, that we'll be discussing during the Congress. We're also going to talk about next week, the Pan African television and Pan African radio. Where we were defeated the most was the mind. There, like I often say, we are not sick at home. We are not sick in the doctor's office. We are not sick in the ward, in the hospital. We are sick in the intensive care. You see, if we're going to fail at what we are doing, it's not because an outsider is going to make us fail. We are going to fail because one who looks like you and I is the one who's going to take us down. We're going to implode from within. It's because those few who are going to be vulnerable, who are still not awoken, are going to be used as instruments of our own self-destruction. So the issue of the mind is a critical one. It goes to the core of who we are. It goes to the core of why lives are what they are within us, among us as Black people. The division started even during slavery. Before slavery back in Africa, divide and conquer. We don't love each other. We don't trust each other. Why can't we be like other races? The Jews, they don't have to love each other. They don't have to like each other. But when it comes to Jewish issues, they stick together like super glue. The Irish, the Chinese, the Indians. But there's something about us, and it was intentional, and it was by design, to destroy us where it matters the most, the mind. We must continue to preach the gospel of truth. We must continue to speak our facts. And that is the only way that we can awaken our people. Too many of us have been misinformed. Too many of us have been miseducated, intentionally, if I may say. But those of us who are awoken, we have a responsibility to wake others up through knowledge and understanding of what is really going on in our Africa and in our world as people of African descent. So continuing to educate our people, starting with the young ones, and making a dent into the educational systems that need revamping, educational systems that must be completely wiped out, a new curriculum started, So through the Pan African television and radio, we'll begin that journey. We will be asking Zimbabwe to also house our Pan African radio and our Pan African television. Last but not least, the city of return. It's imperative that every country in Africa establish a city of return. That they must do. That they owe to us. And so, Zimbabwe shall be the first one to offer us, we will be asking, to offer us a place and land to give us the first city of return, which we hope every country in Africa will agree to give us a location for our entry into any African country, because it is not easy to just find yourself in a new land. But certain parameters we're going to discuss, how the city of return is going to be structured, but is our way of saying, also within the city of return is going to be our subsidiaries, or I'm not sure what you would call them, the extensions of the 6th region, which of course the headquarters is going to be outside, but a place to go to if you are a person of African descent and you're going into a particular country. It's a welcome center. It's a center that can show you the ins and out. If you're interested in investing, there's a place you go that will show you around and say, what are you interested in? These are the things, this is how you get around, and just make it easier and gives you a safe landing as we begin this journey of coming back home. We owe this not only to ourselves, but to our children and generations to come. My hope is that we can look at these very practical things that we are owed, and we must demand them. Because once we are in addition to asking, and I forgot to mention, in addition to asking for 10 to 15 positions in the PRC, ambassador positions, we must also ask for representation within the organs of the AU, such as Pan African Parliament, the NEPAD. We need to represent ourselves from inside. If there are any issues that we need to discuss, it's easier to discuss them from inside. For us to continue to complain from 10,000 miles away, it's not going to work. And I'll be very honest with you. I think sometimes when we have complained, we may not have complained with full understanding of the issues. And hence, in some cases, we were seen as jokers. That needs to change. The reality is the African heads of states, they know, and I know for a fact it's true, that they understand that the diaspora are needed, that the African diaspora are game changers. And I'm doing my part to let them know every time they speak that when you talk about the African diaspora, you're talking about all people of African descent. You see, the fear is one African president doesn't want to be seen as crossing the lines if he starts advocating and pulling diaspora that are not from his country. I've seen a little bit of fear on that. I gotta be careful how I say this, because I don't know how the other heads of states are gonna look at it. So there are all those little stupid nuances that take place, but they're also real. But I do know that if we were to come up with demands that are practical, demands that show we are ready to take the driver's seat of Africa's development, the African heads of states are ready to listen. But we have to be practical, and we have to be realistic, and we have to engage the Africans on the continent. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to be sitting in those parliaments, deliberating on our demands. I hope I've given you an overview of what's getting ready to happen in Zimbabwe. Some of you, I knew they were individuals who were working in various sectors. I don't believe I know most of you. Some names I've seen around. People like Dr. Jeffries, I know him well, and I know his organization well. But beyond that, some of you, I'm not so sure that I know you or even know how to get in touch with you. That's why I'm so grateful to Brother Siphiwe. When he reached out to me, I suggested that he must come to Harare. Let's spend some time, because this issue is not about ADDI. And let me make that very clear. This is not about ADDI. ADDI is a facilitator. I made that very clear to the president. ADDI is a facilitator. This is about the people. This is not an ADDI program. This is about what the African heads of state say. We need a true gathering with true representation of children of Africa from all over the world, every corner of the world. We want as many countries on earth represented. That gathering is going to be the gathering that they're going to listen to. So it's important that each and every one of you be part of that gathering, be part of that conversation, because we must be on the driver's seat of Africa's development. We must be represented at every level of the African Union leadership. A very important component of Africa's development is not at the table. That's what this meeting is about. And that's why this particular PAC 8, PAC 1 is important, because it is very focused on development, more specifically, reclaiming our economic liberation. Let me get you where I ended up coming back to PAC 8. On my second visit with President Museveni, during our deliberations, he had reviewed the documents I sent him, and he felt very strongly that it was a very focused event and that it needed to be called Part 1 in order to incorporate some of the other issues that were dealt with in 1994. He further also said he would like to sponsor and host PAC 8, Part 2, which is a larger conversation, and he would like to also use it to commemorate 30 years since he sponsored PAC 7 in 1994. And that's how we ended up with PAC 8, Part 1, with Part 2 hopefully being in Kampala, Uganda next year. On this note, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. I yield back to you, Brother Siphiwe.